Hey class, I hope y'all are doing well today. Our third exam is coming up in the class, and I just wanted to give y'all a little brief exam review so that y'all feel well prepared to ace this exam. So we'll just go over some of these key terms and concepts that you'll see on your next exam for Unit 3. All right, so we're going to go over the global inequality kind of key concepts and terms here on these first few slides. So we'll start with that Gini coefficient. So when it comes to measuring global inequality, kind of the most common way to kind of determine how inequality is across all the different countries in the world is the Gini coefficient. It's pretty complex, but for this class, you just need to know the Gini coefficient. It measures income inequality. It's based on a 100-point scale. So if you're at 0, that means that there's complete equality. So if we had a Gini coefficient of 0, that would mean every person across any nation on Earth was pretty much had the same kind of life expectancy and quality of life. However, as you get closer to 1 on the Gini scale, that represents more inequality going on between different nations. So as you can see on this little graph over here, it's tracking the Gini coefficient from 1820. This graph ends in 2008. So, but you can see back in 1820 we had a Gini coefficient around 0.5. So definitely not 0, but not 1 either. But you can see over time, after kind of industrialization and a lot of capitalization of the global marketplace, you see increasing global inequality through this Gini coefficient. But then as you see, and you hear about this a lot, that things kind of leveled off around the 90s. So you see how kind of it flattened out and even went down a little bit. But we're still around 0.65 for the Gini coefficient for global inequality. So certainly more inequality across nations than in 1820, but we'll see. Maybe over time things will go down a little bit. So basically, what you want to know for this is 0 represents complete equality and 1 represents complete inequality. And this is a very common formula that's used when comparing different countries in terms of income. All right, we'll continue with that chapter on global inequality. So we went over a few theories, sociological theories in this chapter when it comes to global stratification or inequality. So modernization theory is kind of your classical perspective on global stratification. So modernization theory, it views low-income countries as just kind of falling behind or falling short in terms of industrialization. And so the idea is with more industrialization comes more income, more capitalization, and more money that can be spread across the populations in order to bring everybody's kind of standard of living up in order to kind of reduce poverty in those countries. So if you're a modernization theorist and you see a really destitute country, a modernization theorist would say, well, first you need to change your cultural values, your attitudes toward work and money. You know, the citizens need to start going and working day jobs every day instead of just working agrarian or just farming their own land. They need to actually have jobs to go to, and also changing attitudes about money. So in the US, we're very accustomed to kind of living day in and day out based on how much money is in our bank account, but not every country is like that, and not every culture prioritizes money in that way. So a modernization theorist would say, number one, these poorer countries need to change their kind of those values and attitudes about work and money. The second thing they would propose would be to, again, I said a lot of those people in the poorer countries it's a very agricultural society. It's not very industrial. So they would suggest that they move away from those traditional agricultural kind of social organizations and move toward industrialization in order to kind of pursue more economic growth. So obviously the US, from our perspective, we're so deeply entrenched in kind of this industrial and even post-industrial society that we live in, but it wasn't always like that. Even in the United States, there was a huge movement back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution called distributism or agrarianism, and it was a big political movement in the US that fought against industrialization. So these kind of changes, they happened in the United States as well, though it was about 200 years ago now. So move away from those agricultural kind of social organizations and more toward industrialization. And so basically, main idea for modernization theory is that it assumes that all societies can be equal, but in order to do that, the more destitute nations need to invest in industrialization and modernization in order to kind of eliminate this inequality. But the idea is that all countries can be lifted up and be equal if they do these things. Now, on the other hand, we have Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems approach to global inequality. So he disagrees with modernization theory. Wallerstein doesn't think that all countries can be equal. He thinks there's a kind of inherent inequality that's kind of built in to our international kind of system. That some countries are going to be the richest, some will be kind of middle class, and some will be poor indefinitely. So he comes up with these three different terms. So core nations, peripheral nations, and semi-peripheral. So your core nations are your very, very rich countries. So like the United States, like Germany, Japan, Spain, etc. So these are your dominant capitalist countries. They're highly industrialized, very technological, and the large proportion of their population lives in cities. So it's more urbanized rather than rural and more agricultural. The US is obviously kind of this economic powerhouse. We can support or deny support to important economic legislation, and that can affect the entire world and other countries. So that's what he means when he calls countries like ours and the UK a core nation. We're at the core. So next, I'm going to skip actually to talk about semi-peripheral nations first. So semi-peripheral nations are kind of your countries that are in between. They're kind of your middle class countries, for lack of a better term. So they're kind of these in-between nations. They're not necessarily destitute. They've started to industrialize. However, a lot of that industrialization is kind of wound up or bound by the decisions of the core nations, like the U.S. So some semi-peripheral nations would be like Mexico or China, Turkey, South Africa, Saudi Arabia. So these are countries that they're not able to dictate policy the way that the U.S. can, but they also act as this major resource for raw material and emerging middle-class marketplaces for core nations. So usually in a semi-peripheral nation, you have enough wealthy or well-off people that they can be a useful marketplace for, say, the U.S. to sell whatever products that we export to them. So they're better off, but they don't have that much power. And then we have our peripheral nations here in the middle, and these are your poorest countries, the most destitute, kind of been left behind by the global industrial machine. So countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Honduras. So in these countries, you see very little industrialization. They're still largely agricultural countries. Not a lot of factories going on. What factories they do have are usually kind of outdated cast-offs. So let's say in the U.S., we used to have a bunch of factories, and this was before environmental laws came into effect, really, in the 70s. And so we had a lot of factories that were putting off a whole lot of smog and pollution and so on. But then the U.S. got to a certain point where we made laws. We have the EPA come into effect in the 70s, and we started kind of regulating our factories, regulating emissions, making sure our skies weren't full of pollution. But what happened to all those old kind of factories and machines and whatnot? They weren't thrown away. They were either sold or given to these peripheral nations. So these poorer countries might have some industry, but it's usually probably very heavy on pollution and whatnot, not very regulated. So that's not really great for the people that live there. You also have a lot of instability in the governments, inadequate social programs, so no education programs, not very well developed health programs for public health, etc. And by and large, these nations are very dependent on the semi-peripheral and the core countries in order for them to have jobs and to get aid, financial aid or food aid, or disaster relief, for instance, like in Haiti. So that's Wallerstein's kind of perspective that definitely contrasts with modernization theory. So he instead sees kind of this system of the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery as kind of in this constant kind of give and take of goods and resources, and kind of a hierarchical structure. All right, then we'll go over just some key definitions for Chapter 10. So envision a matching question in your future. So you've got capital flight, and that's what happens when maybe, for instance, the United States changes its regulations on factories and maybe requires employers to give their employees $10 an hour. So setting some sort of minimum wage. Well, when that happens, certain industries don't want to stay in that country with these more strict rules and regulations anymore. So those industries will move to another country. In Wallerstein's terms, they probably move to a semi-peripheral country like Mexico or a peripheral country like the Philippines. So this is capital flight. It's when that movement of capital, notably factories, moves from one nation to another. So obviously one effect of that is we lose a lot of jobs. So like in Columbus, we had Columbus history, you have the mills out here and whatnot, which have now been closed down. So I'm not sure where the mills went, but they went somewhere and the jobs went along with them. So that's capital flight. And then you have deindustrialization, which is the results of capital flight. So when the factories, when the companies move, if no new companies come in to that town or city in order to replace those jobs, then you have this result of deindustrialization, kind of leaving that town behind without really any economic prospects for the people who live there. Then we have 3, structural adjustment and debt accumulation. So this is the buildup of external debt wherein countries borrow money from other nations to fund their expansion or growth goals. So for instance, the United States and the World Bank, which the United States has a lot of say in the World Bank. So the World Bank will go around to more peripheral or lower income countries, and they'll go in and find kind of the political elites, whoever is in charge or seems to be in charge in those countries, and they'll make deals with these people or politicians. And usually they'll say, hey, we're going to give you this loan of $100 million, and in exchange, in order for us to give you this money, you have to use it to do certain things. So you have to build, you have to start drilling for oil, or you need to start building wind turbines. So there'll be some sort of requirement on the loan that they use this money for a certain kind of economic purpose or a purpose of growth. But then over time, obviously those countries owe those loans back to the World Bank, and I put a documentary up in chapter 10 in the video section, which is really good, John Pilger's War by Other Means. But what's happened to a lot of these lower income countries that get these structural adjustment loans is that they just end up accumulating a lot of debt, and over time they're just completely indebted to richer countries, and there's really no way to dig themselves out and pay back all the interest and whatnot. So that's your structural adjustment programs and that kind of resultant debt accumulation that comes about because of it. So you have a lot of uncertainties in the global economy that make it really difficult, almost impossible to repay those debts to institutions like the World Bank, and all the interest on top of those loans. And then we have feminization of poverty, which, put it really succinctly, women are disproportionately affected by global poverty. So usually about 70% of people living in poverty around the world are women. All right, then we have 4 different forms of slavery, which still occur around the world today. So first is, what we saw in the history of the United States, which is chattel slavery. And this is when one person just outright owns another person as their personal property. So certainly what we had in the United States and the colonies before that, until the passage of the 13th Amendment, was chattel slavery. And other things like child slavery and child prostitution that still certainly go on today are qualified as this also. And your second form of slavery is debt bondage. So this is when people, usually poor people, will pledge themselves as servants in exchange for the cost of basic necessities like transportation or room and board. So a lot of times in poorer countries, say like Bangladesh, richer people from other countries will come in and say, hey, we'll help you with your applying for your visa and your immigration papers, and we'll pay for your air, your flight to, let's say, England, just to make things simple. So we'll pay for your airfare from Bangladesh to England, and we'll put you up in a room when you get there. We'll make sure that you're fed every day, but in exchange, we're going to take you to England so that you can be, a servant and take care, maybe be a nanny for a really rich family or a housekeeper. So it's debt bondage. You're kind of in debt to them for providing for the basics for you, but in exchange, you're kind of left to their whims. The third type of slavery is human trafficking. So this is obviously still a very big global business, unfortunately, where people are moved away from their communities and forced to work against their will. And then servile marriage is when one person is forced to marry another person, again, against their will, usually in exchange for money. Right, and then we have a few more little definitions and differences. Got relative poverty, absolute poverty, and subjective poverty. So relative poverty is usually what we see in the United States. It's a state of living where people can afford the necessities, can afford to feed themselves, put some sort of roof over their head, but they're unable to meet society's average standard of living. So if you ever sit in your house and then you're watching TV and the people on TV have a big beautiful house and a swimming pool and the newest appliances, and then you sit in your house and you're like, oh, I don't have all these things, that's relative poverty. You are able to get by every day. You're not starving. You have a home. You're not freezing out in the elements or left to hide under a tree if there's a hurricane that comes through. So you have shelter, but you might not be able to afford the newest gadgets, the iPhone 12, and you might not be able to afford a washer and a dryer. You might have to walk to the local laundromat. But that doesn't mean that you're living in absolute poverty. So that's our next term. So absolute poverty is when you absolutely lack these basic necessities like food, clean water, sanitation, safe housing, access to healthcare and education. Certainly there is absolute poverty in the United States, but relative poverty is more common. We see more absolute poverty in places like Bangladesh and India, again, those peripheral nations. And if we are taking the World Bank definition, they define someone as living in absolute poverty when they live on less than $1.90 a day. And that would also include, their housing cost and whatnot. So it's not a lot of money to live on per day. Then I have subjective poverty. So it's really all about how you feel about your own life. So it's subjective. It has to do more with how a person or a family define themselves in relation to society. So poverty can be subjectively experienced when your actual income doesn't meet your personal expectations and perceptions. So basically, subjective poverty is, let's imagine in Tasmania, there's a family living out in the middle of nowhere, quote unquote, on their own little farm, and they meet their daily needs, but they might not have a fridge, they might not have a washer dryer or a TV or a cell phone, but they love each other and they have a happy family and they're able to feed themselves with their little farm. So that's basically subjective poverty. They might be very, very happy with their lives. They might not know or want anything more than that. And so if they're happy with it, then that's all that matters. However, if you or me or someone from the US were to go there, we might think, oh no, these people are living in such horrible conditions. They don't have a cell phone, they don't have air conditioning, etc. So from our perspective, our own subjectivity, we would interpret it as poverty, but they might not. They might be completely happy. And so from their perspective, their subjective feelings, they do not feel poor. So it's kind of, poverty is in the eye of the beholder, kind of an idea. And consequences of poverty. So we talked about Neckerman and Torch again in chapter 10. So Neckerman and Torch were sociologists studying poverty, and they pretty much decided that the consequences of poverty are also its causes, and they kind of split up poverty into 3 different areas that are consequential. So we've got number 1, sedimentation of global inequality. So this is basically an idea that poverty is a self-reinforcing cycle. It's really hard to break out of. Once you're poor and once there's poverty entrenched in an entire town or area, it's almost like with each passing month, every passing year, it becomes more and more impossible to even imagine getting out of that state. So it's kind of this sedimentation. Things just kind of settle in, and it becomes really hard to climb out of that situation. So for instance, if you're in a place that you didn't have good education growing up, where houses were dilapidated and falling apart, it's like once you live in that kind of social situation, it becomes really hard. If you didn't have an education growing up, if no one ever taught you to read, how can you go get a good job? You would have to first teach yourself to read and maybe teach yourself basic mathematics before you could even think about going and trying to get a quote-unquote good job. So it's the way that kind of poverty can become settled in and very hard to overcome. And the second part is the effects that it has on physical and mental health. So things like malnutrition, high infant mortality rates, all the emotional stresses with having to worry every single day where your meal is going to come from, if your roof is going to collapse, etc. So kind of these stresses of daily life that come with poverty. And then prevalence of crime. With really high poverty rates also comes higher crime rates, unfortunately. So particularly violent crime becomes more widespread in areas of great poverty. All right, so now we'll do a little chapter 11 recap. So this was the chapter on race and ethnicity. So quite fitting for this slide where we have the 2 definitions. So race refers to your superficial physical differences that a society considers significant. So in actuality, when it comes to our biology, they're very superficial differences, but it's society who puts kind of these connotations on different races that we have literally constructed. So there's absolutely no biological explanation for racial differences. It's very much a social construct. Then we have ethnicity. So like race, ethnicity is also very hard to kind of pinpoint and define, and its meaning changes over time. So ethnicity is also very cultural. It describes a culture, things like practices, your religion, your beliefs, your values, the things that are shared by the social group that you're a part of, the way that you dance, the food that you eat, the art that you enjoy, etc. So having even things like your language are boiled down to your ethnicity. All right, then we have minority groups. So a minority group, it's any group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, they're singled out from others in society, and usually they're treated differently or inequitably. And over time, these minority groups will start to regard themselves as objects of collective kind of social discrimination. They don't have the privileges that other groups in the society have, and they will start to recognize this. So minority groups can also be referred to as subordinate groups, while majority groups are considered to be more of your dominant groups in society when it comes to social power. So who has power in the banking system, who has power in politics, etc. And then most importantly here for your exam question is that a minority group doesn't necessarily mean that the group is a numerical minority. So that doesn't mean they're the smallest racial group in the country and that they're being inequitably treated because of that. Large groups can also be labeled a minority group. So the key thing when we're defining a minority is the lack of power. So it's about lack of social power and not necessarily about what percentage of the population is made up of that group. So for instance, in apartheid South Africa, white South Africans were certainly in the minority if we're looking at it numerically, but yet socially, in terms of power in society, white South Africans had a lot more power than the black South Africans, even though they were a larger in number. Then we had all those intergroup relations that we went over in that spectrum from pluralism to extermination. So what's important here in terms of your exam to take note of is that pluralism, remember, is that most tolerant of the intergroup relations. There's no distinction made between different groups of people. Everyone is equal, we respect everyone, everyone brings their strengths to the table. So that's pluralism, and there would be, a great mixture of different cultures, kind of respect for all these different cultures and what they bring to the whole of the country. And there's a lot of mutual respect on the part of everyone, a multicultural environment of acceptance. So if I ask you what the most tolerant intergroup relation is, you'll think of pluralism, hopefully. Then another of the intergroup relations I went over was amalgamation. So this is a process when a minority group and a majority group combine. So basically it's intermarriage between different ethnicities or races. So it kind of blurs the line between where societies can define one race or ethnicity ends and another begins. So one Supreme Court case in the United States that was really important to this idea or term of amalgamation was the Loving versus Virginia case. That was in 1967. And that court case decided that on the federal level across all states, they were going to strike down laws that banned interracial marriage. So it's pretty significant in our country's history. Then another one of our intergroup relations was segregation. So for this one, we'll go over the definition real quick. Segregation is that physical separation of two groups. So think back to the Jim Crow South, right, where we had policies where there would be a movie theater and there would be an entrance for whites only, and then a separate movie theater in the back for African Americans to go to. Or same with bathrooms and water fountains and public schools. So segregation is that physical separation of two groups of people, particularly in residence, so where you live, but also in the workplace and social functions. But what I really want you to pay attention to on this slide is the difference between de jure segregation and de facto. And really, if you just kind of think about the terms, it'll help you out on the exam. So if you think about the word jury or juror, hopefully now, after you watch this, you'll think of the word jury. If you think of the word jury, what do you think about? The court system, you know, juries sit in a court, you get jury duty, you have to go sit through a court case. So when you see de jure segregation, think of, you know, the courts. What do courts deal with? They deal with the law. So de jure segregation is segregation that is enforced by the law. So again, how it was in the US during the Jim Crow era before it got outlawed, or again in apartheid South Africa. That kind of segregation was backed by the legal system. However, even after you get rid of these laws that enforce segregation, even when you get rid of them, there's still this kind of lingering form of segregation that can kind of stick behind, and we refer to that as de facto segregation. So de facto, in fact, it is actually happening, despite the fact that there are no laws enforcing it anymore. So this is segregation that's enforced by custom, can't be abolished just by a court mandate or changing a law. Even if you think about maybe some of your grandparents or great-grandparents, if you knew them, that maybe grew up in a more kind of Jim Crow South in the United States. It just because laws were overturned didn't mean that all of a sudden everyone woke up the next morning and everyone was smiling and running through the streets, happy, skipping, holding hands among the races, right? So kind of getting through segregation, getting rid of it, it doesn't just happen when you know, a politician signs a piece of paper. It happens over time. Society and culture has to also catch up with that law and fully accept it in order for de facto segregation to kind of fade away. Right, then we have the Jane Elliott study. So Jane Elliott was an elementary school teacher back in the day, in the 60s, 70s, and she conducted this brown eye, blue eye experiment. And it became really well known kind of in this era especially, and obviously we still teach it in sociology class. So Jane Elliott, she had kind of witnessed this whole civil rights era, was seeing a lot of racism and racist comments from her students who were elementary school kids. And she had also recently seen Martin Luther King Jr. be assassinated, or heard of that happening, or saw it on the news, and she was very distraught by the fact that that happened. And so she decided to put together this little brown eye, blue eye experiment and have her kids take part in it in class one day. So basically it was a direct experiment with the students in her classroom. They came in one day and she had them all sit down and she said, okay, people with brown eyes are better than people with blue eyes. And then she made the brown-eyed students put construction paper armbands on the blue-eyed students, so as kind of to signify that they were different or less than. And then Elliott made the case that brown-eyed people were better students. And then over time, throughout the day, she started to notice that the brown-eyed children started to act more aggressive and mean and start bullying the blue-eyed children. And that's just because the authority figure, their teacher, told them that they were better than the other students, just based on their eye color. So over time, throughout the day, they were kind of bullying those blue-eyed kids, and the blue-eyed kids felt discriminated against. They didn't think it was fair. And so that was kind of a way that an experiment she did to kind of open the discussion to the kids about racism and kind of where our ideas about race originate and whether or not there's really any truth to them. So she had a little quote here, "You're not born racist, you're born into a racist society. And like anything else, if you can learn it, you can unlearn it. But some people choose not to unlearn it, either because they're afraid they'll lose power, if they share with other people. And we're afraid of sharing power, and that's what it's all about," said Jane Elliott. Then we've got our key terms for Chapter 12. I see another matching question in your future. So we've got gender identity. So that's just somebody's deeply held internal perception of his or her gender. It's what they perceive their gender to be. Then we have doing gender, and this is kind of that idea that we kind of act out roles according to what gender we've been assigned. So when people perform tasks or exhibit characteristics based on gender roles assigned to them. So if you're a little boy and you scraped your knee and you're 4 years old and you start crying, and say your mom or your dad comes out and says, "Stop crying, you're a man, you're not a little girl," that would be, and then he stops crying and sucks it up and walks away. That's an example of doing gender. So in essence, gender is something kind of we do, we perform, and not something that we are. And then we have transgender and transsexual. So transgender is someone who identifies with a role that is different from their biological sex. So if I was born a woman, it says that I'm a female on my birth certificate, but over time I started to realize that I identified more as a male than I would be a transgender. A transsexual goes a little bit further, and so a transsexual is someone who feels that they don't align with the kind of that biological sex that they were assigned as a baby, and they actually attempt to alter their body through medical interventions or hormonal therapy in order so that their physical being can be more in line with what they feel their gender identity is. So a transgender is somebody who identifies with a different gender than they were assigned at birth. A transsexual is someone who doesn't feel comfortable with their kind of their gendered body, and they want to change their body in order to become more in line with how they feel and how they identify. Then let's see, we have the 3 waves of feminism. So I'll go over these kind of quickly. So we had first wave feminism. This is really started back in Seneca Falls in New York back in the 1800s, the first women's rights convention. Then 1860s, we saw a big rise of women's suffrage organizations, primarily focused on getting the right of women to vote. So we had a lot of organizations starting back then with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and during this time we also had advocates of the temperance movement, which was against alcohol, and they argued that women should have a greater role in decisions concerning public life. Then 1916, we have the National Women's Party form to advocate for that amendment for women to vote. And then 3 years later, we had the 19th Amendment pass in the U.S. Senate, giving women the right to vote. So that's your first wave, is really primarily focused on more political participation for women and obviously gaining that right to vote. Then we had the second wave, and this kind of came about in the 60s and the 70s with the hippie movement and the anti-war and free love and all that good stuff. So in second wave feminism was really focused more on the woman's role in the household, women wanting to get out and be able to get jobs other than as secretaries. The fight for equal pay, more expression of women's sexuality. So certainly also this is the wave where we saw kind of the emergence of the birth control pill and Roe versus Wade going through the Supreme Court. It was 1973. So fights for reproductive rights, the right to have an abortion if the woman so chose. So that was the main kind of focus of your second wave feminism, was like, okay, we have the vote now, but now we don't want to be housewives anymore, and we want to go get jobs and be paid equally, and we want to have autonomy over our own bodies. So that's second wave. And then third wave is more recent, kind of most people pinpoint it around the late 80s and kind of still with us today. So third wave feminism is more about embracing individuality, diversity, bringing in more diverse women into the movement, because the first and second wave were primarily movements of Caucasian women. So third wave was really about kind of inclusion, representing all women of all colors and cultures. So there's less of a focus on kind of all this political activism that we saw with the first and second wave, and more of an emphasis on personal empowerment and kind of taking control of our own lives. So those are your 3 waves right there of feminism. And then, well, like I was saying on that last slide, the first and second wave of feminism was very often critiqued by particularly African American women who said that the movement didn't really represent them. Most of the women who were really taking charge during that fight for the right to vote and kind of getting out of that role of housewife. It was primarily a movement for white women. Because if you think about it, African American women have really never been relegated to this role of housewife. African American women have always worked hard. They've never been, sitting around in the kitchen all day. So then back in 1851, actually kind of right at the crux of the first wave of feminism, we had Sojourner Truth, who was a former slave, and she made a really famous speech called "Ain't I a Woman?" Which I put a little video clip of in your chapter, what was that, chapter 12, PowerPoint. So Sojourner Truth, she was a former slave, and she became a preacher eventually after this speech. But she stood up in front of this women's convention in Ohio, which was primarily white women, and she made a brief speech that kind of brought to light all these racial inequalities that were being ignored by the women's movement, that they were kind of leaving out African American women. When they talked about the experience of women in the United States, they weren't really speaking to the daily experience of African American women. So she kind of successfully pointed out this double standard that existed within the movement and was a voice for Black women who felt unrepresented. See, back to our gender definitions. So toward the beginning of that lecture, I talked about how the dichotomous view of gender, and that is the notion that someone is either a man or a woman. There's no kind of middle ground. So that dichotomous view is specific to certain cultures and is not universal. So I don't get into that in this review here, but if you go back to the chapter, you'll see kind of where I talked about the Samoan Fa'afafine, all these different cultures, the Hijra of India, all these different countries that actually acknowledge more than two genders. We're very used to, in the United States and Western societies, thinking of just man or woman, but even Native American tribes recognized a third gender. So that's not something that's universal. It's very much cultural. And then intersectionality. So intersectionality is kind of how all the different aspects of our identities intertwine and have an effect on our daily lives. So, for instance, let's say I'm a white American woman. So while I have kind of these social privileges that come with being white, I don't have to be afraid of a police officer pulling me over, for instance. So that is certainly a privilege. At the same time, I'm also a woman, and generally it's thought that women are not as privileged as men. If we go back to the last chapter, women by and large make up the majority of people living in poverty. Women by and large are victims of domestic abuse. Women don't generally get paid the same as a man does for the same job. So if we think about intersectionality, it's the way that our different aspects of our identity kind of intertwine and balance with each other. So yes, I'm a white American, which is certainly a privilege in this world. At the same time, I'm a woman, so there's aspects, or I identify as a woman. And so there's certain aspects of that maybe are more of a hindrance and not a privilege. So it's the way that these different aspects of our identities interact and kind of where we find ourselves in the midst of all these different social definitions that are placed on us. So intersectionality assumes that each person possesses a multitude of identities that shape who they are and how they experience the world around them, and how we interpret things that are going on. So humans, we embody our identities in a way that's unique to us. So intersectionality relates to kind of the systematic oppression of minority populations. So for instance, intersectionality would include discussions about sex, gender, race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, religious belief, sexual orientation, age, and ability, and would kind of consider how all these different overlapping and interdependent systems of kind of hierarchy and discrimination or oppression, disadvantage or advantage, how they all kind of like mingle inside of each of us as individuals, and we have to kind of navigate where we land in the middle of all these different kind of hierarchies of status in our society. All right, then sex and gender. So really key here is that these two terms have different definitions. So sex and gender are not the same thing. Even though they're used interchangeably very often, if you really go down to the definitions of each one, they're different. So sex has to do with your physiological differences between males and females, including our primary sex characteristics. Do you have a penis or do you have a vagina? And your secondary characteristics, like how tall you are, how muscular you are. So these sex traits are things that can be seen. They're physical. You can measure them. Whereas gender is more of, again, that kind of social construct. If we go back to that term doing gender from a few slides ago. So sex has to do with kind of these physical attributes, and then gender is more imbued with social judgments. So behaviors, personal traits that are associated with each gender, like men are associated with being aggressive, women are associated with being submissive. Those kind of gendered personal traits that society sets up for us. So all these different kind of behaviors, ways of thinking, ways of acting that society attributes to either being male or female. So again, it's a social construct. A person's biologically determined sex does not necessarily correspond to their gender. Then we have the Kinsey scale and Alfred Kinsey. So Kinsey was researching back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and he was really interested in studying sexual history of individuals, of gay men, of couples, married couples, in order to see kind of a bigger picture of what was going on kind of behind closed doors in American culture. So Kinsey and his team went around all over the country, across to universities, different towns, and they just kind of sat down with couples and individuals, different kinds of people, and different races, all sorts of variations, and interviewed them in order to get kind of a clearer picture of sexual behavior in the United States. And basically what he found after all these interviews, him and his team concluded that there really are not these kind of strict categories of you're either completely heterosexual or you're completely homosexual. You're either straight or you're gay, and there's nothing in between. So he was saying, no, there's a lot of gray area actually between these kind of terms of heterosexual or homosexual. And he found throughout all of his interviews that most people kind of landed somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Maybe they were married, maybe it's a man married to a woman for 25 years, but when he was 18, maybe he had a one night with another man. So he kind of found that these kind of stories were actually a lot more common than he thought they were going to be. And so he basically determined that instead of exclusively kind of assigning people to either you're straight or you're gay, and that's it, he said there needed to be more categories for people to fit into, because he was finding that most people didn't fit into them. So he and his team proposed this 7-point scale that's now referred to as the Kinsey scale, and it ranges from 0 to 6. I think 0 is completely heterosexual, 6 is completely homosexual, and then they even had an additional category of X, because he also found throughout his interviews that there were some people that quite literally didn't have any sexual interest or inclinations whatsoever. And so he labeled those individuals as the X category. So that's Kinsey and the Kinsey scale. Basic for that is just remember he found that people don't fit into those two exclusive categories of hetero or homosexual, and that there was kind of a range of positions between those two categories that most people actually fell into in between them. All right, now we got chapter 13, it's the aging and the elderly chapter. So we'll go over these key definitions from this chapter here. So again, I see a matching question in your future. So we have senescence. Get my little pen. Senescence is the aging process that includes biological, emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual changes. So it's kind of like an overarching study of the aging process. Then we have gerontology. So this is a field of science. You got that ology in there. So it's a field of science that seeks to understand the process of aging and the challenges encountered as people grow older. But that can have to do with all sorts of things, medical things, things that are biologically happening to your body. So then that's why we have another category, which is social gerontology, which is a specialized field of gerontology that specifically looks at kind of the social and sociological aspects of aging. So things that we get into in this chapter, like when people retire, kind of the challenges that they face not having to go to work or kind of feel like that sort of fulfillment from your normal work day anymore, and how do you cope with that? How do you cope with your children growing older and moving farther away? How do you cope with your friends passing away as y'all are getting older? So kind of those social aspects of getting older. And then we have centenarians and super centenarians. So these should hopefully be a little easier. We've got centenarians are people who live to be at least 100, and super centenarians are people who live at least 110 years or more. We've got this term, the graying of the United States, and basically what you want to know here is that the U.S. government, if you want to apply for Social Security benefits or Medicare, the U.S. government defines old age as 65 years old. So you have to be 65 in order to get those government benefits. However, there's other groups like the AARP in which you only have to be 50 to sign up and be qualified as an elderly American. But for your exam question, just remember that the U.S. government defines old age or elderly people as being 65 or older. Then in chapter 13 also went over Erik Erikson. So he was a sociologist who specifically studied kind of different life stages. So he decided that life was kind of divided into these 8 different stages, starting with birth and then adolescence, and getting married, starting your own family, and your kids move out, and then you're retired, and the empty nest period, and then you kind of get to this last stage of old age. So, and for each stage, each of these 8 stages that he came up with, he kind of introduced like the main social challenge that comes about during that stage. So we're not going to worry about the first 7, but for that last stage of old age, he said the primary challenge during that phase is to embrace integrity over despair. So some people might not be able to face that challenge, the challenge of seeing their job go away because they've retired or maybe they got laid off, the kind of loneliness that can come with being older, not having as big of a social circle anymore. Maybe your kids live across the country, and they don't, necessarily quote unquote need you for their day-to-day survival anymore. So that can be really lonely. So he was saying kind of the main challenge during this period of our lives is to kind of meet it with integrity, meet it with positivity, make the best of it, make the best of our time on this earth rather than lingering in kind of this loneliness and this despair. So he said that's kind of the choice that we will all have to face one day if we're lucky enough to live into old age. Also, at this point in life, you might start kind of having a lot of regrets or disappointments, things that you wish you would have done or wish you wouldn't have done. So that is also part of kind of this challenging period of life. So he said some people linger in despair and they can't really see beyond their regrets. But others are able to embrace integrity and kind of face this new life, new phase in their life with energy and creativity and positivity. They might, go join a hobby group and get together with other people their age. Maybe they go play bridge at night, or have a little sewing group, or have a little football watching group on Sunday nights with other guys from church that are their age. Can also spend this time really, cherishing, getting to know your loved ones, sharing your life stories with them, and kind of use that time to peacefully prepare for the end of their life in such a way that they can go happily and not with regrets. So basically, main thing here is Erik Erikson. He's a sociologist. He studied different stages of the life cycle, and in particular with this stage of old age, the biggest challenge is to embrace integrity over despair. And then we have thanatology and Kevorkian here. So thanatology is the systematic study of death and dying. So looking at how different cultures deal with the end of life, coping with it or celebrating it or despairing over it. So of particular interest to thanatologists is this concept of dying with dignity. And in particular, in the US, we had Dr. Jack Kevorkian, and he was a very big deal back in the 80s and 90s, and was a staunch advocate for physician-assisted suicide, which is also voluntary or a physician-assisted use of lethal medication that's provided by a trained medical doctor in order to end your life. So there's a few states in the United States that have passed laws to allow physician-assisted suicide, like Oregon and Montana, Colorado, Washington, California. But obviously it's a very hot button issue because suicide, of course, is imbued with a lot of religious implications, and so a lot of people, of course, are not supportive of this practice. But Kevorkian, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, made an argument that physician-assisted suicide was, in his view, the compassionate thing to do. So if you all have ever known anyone who really got into old age and a lot of health issues, maybe ended up in the hospital for, who knows, months, weeks, months, or longer, on life support and getting food fed to them through tubes, or have a lot of constant pain all day long if you have a terminal cancer. So Jack Kevorkian was basically saying it's the compassionate thing to help these people end their lives if they so choose to. So it was in the hands of the person who was choosing this, and not decided by the doctor. But he felt that it was more compassionate to help them kind of, quote, die with dignity instead of kind of just linger in a hospital bed for who knows how long with no kind of quality of life or enjoyment. And the last slide here, we've got these different challenges that face the elderly, particularly mistreatment and abuse that can happen at this life stage. Obviously, when you're older, you become a lot more dependent on others in order for your kind of day-to-day care and existence. And becoming older also tends to come with a lot of kind of frailty. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times this can result in elder abuse, and we'll go over the 5 different forms of that. But basically, elder abuse is when a caretaker intentionally deprives an older person of care or just outright harms the person. Caregivers might be family members, they might be friends, health professionals, or employees at a senior housing or nursing care facility. So we have 5 different categories of elder abuse here. Number 1, physical abuse, so actually hitting or shaking somebody. We have sexual abuse, rape or coerced nudity, when the person does not want that. Then we have psychological abuse, which is verbal harassment or kind of like cruelly humiliating somebody by belittling them. And then neglect or failure to provide adequate care, not washing somebody's bedding, if they kind of soiled their pants, not changing it for a day or two, poor hygiene, dehydration, not giving someone food, etc. So that's neglect or failure to provide adequate care. And then financial abuse or exploitation. So if somebody makes a change to someone's will shortly before they pass away, or if additional names are added to their bank cards so that someone can go spend all that money. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect, and financial abuse. And let's see, yep, that is the last slide here. So there's 25 questions on this Unit 3 exam. Everything in this exam review is all you need to know to ace that exam. So I hope this helped me walking through it kind of step by step for you. If you have any questions, if I didn't go into detail enough on anything and you want some clarification, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help and make sure things are completely clear for you before you take the exam. All right, thank you. I hope to hear from y'all soon and hope you're having a great day. Bye, y'all.